Hi, everybody. My name is Rasheedah Phillips. I'm from Philadelphia. Just got in 2 hours ago. I run an organization called the Afrofuturist Affair that was started in 2011 in Philadelphia, as well as a co-founding member of Black Quantum Futurism Collective with More Mother, who will be here tomorrow and will be doing a performance tomorrow. Today I'm going to talk about clocks and time and sci-fi and Afrofuturism and all that fun stuff. I'm going to talk for a while, and then afterwards you are free to ask me any questions that you would like for a limited time because I'm about to fall asleep because I'm very tired. And I also have some books up here for sale. I left some of them back at my hotel, so I'll have more over the weekend if they sell out or if you don't see one up there that you wanted to get. But we have 5 titles, and I have 4 of them up there. Where is the master clock? Who watches it, and who keeps time? If the master clock stops, does time stop? Most people take their everyday experiences of time as a factual, unalterable facet of reality. There are clocks that chart the hours, minutes, and seconds, calendars that chart the march of days, months, and years, suns, planets, and stars that chart the ages. More subtle, however, are the ways in which time governs our social interactions, regulates our emotions and our movements, frames our worldviews, informs our politics, and leaks into our very consciousness. The ways in which we are situated in time are reflected in how we talk about, think about, and conceptualize the world around us. As Kevin Burf said, it is not immediately apparent that the clock and the Gregorian calendar are culturally conceived tools that direct thought about time. In America and many other places, natural time and environmental cycles and rhythms has been abstracted and overthrown by Western linear time, where temporal orientation is facilitated by clocks, schedules, cell phones, and digital calendars. When you think about the future, near or far, what imagery comes to mind for you? Do you picture spaceships? Do you picture robots or genetic engineering? If popular speculative media, literature, and film are any indication, the images that people draw to mind when envisioning the future generally include post-apocalyptic landscapes, advanced technology, and space travel. Glaringly absent from these visions of the future, however, are representations of diverse cultures and complicated intersectional identities. Though traditional science fiction has been able to successfully conceive of novel technologies and entire new species and universes, it has, on the whole, failed to transcend the oppressive conditions and social hierarchies that are etched into our present-day realities. But science fiction is not the only realm in which the future has been taken for granted. I believe we all take the future for granted daily, and we do this because we encounter the future daily, if not moment to moment, whether it's in an ad promotion, in a song, or in casual conversation about what we're going to do next. The future is ever present, both mundane and cosmic, but again, rarely do we think of where the future is, who has access to it, and whether we are all accelerating at the same rate and pace into that future. We almost never think about how gender, race, and income shifts the means of access to the future. The word future, by definition, designates a time period or temporal space that is not now, one that is situated ahead or before us, and one that is distinctive from the times that lie behind or before the one we are currently situated in. Etymologically, future developed out of the old French word futur during the late 14th century and meant a time after the present or that which is yet to be. Future can be traced back further to the Latin futurus via the stem fu, which means to grow or to become, which is also the future participle of the word esse, which means to be. The Oxford English Dictionary notes that both esse and future share be at their root, which may explain why the word before can both denote an event that has already passed and is now in the past, or an event that has not yet happened. Notions of the future, that which lies ahead, vary greatly and are closely connected to cultural notions of time and temporality. A traditional European spatial temporal consciousness, for example, prior to the 14th century, saw time as a matter of flow and inevitability. Early recordings of an abstract sense of time as a continuous duration arose during the 14th century, while the word time itself derives from the word division, to cut up or to flood, as in the time of high water. Within the European Judeo-Christian religious order, work and prayer times were heavily regulated by law, and because of a belief in biblical apocalyptic visions of the end being near, time had to be very tightly regulated. In the book Time Wars, Jeremy Rifkin notes that Western culture institutionalized its images of the future by way of religion and politics, making sure that the future could be both made predictable and controlled. It is through religion and politics that a linear temporal orientation first came to be discerned, simultaneous to the development of Western culture. A linear Western time consciousness stresses fixed events along a forward-moving timeline, while events themselves are seen as irreversible. The linear timeline is embedded within cyclical time. Hours, minutes, and seconds in their abstract numerical form will repeat. However, events themselves are unique occurrences that will never repeat on a progressive linear timescale. The structure of time eventually came to be organized discretely and causally into a past, a present, and a future, with fixed events set against a forward-moving timeline and one that would eventually come to a climatic and chaotic end. The increased building and usage of public clocks and eventually personal watches and timepieces further inscribed a mechanical order of time, impacting all aspects of the Western way of life. Stuart Bovell notes in Time Maps that only in the last couple of millennia did our uncompromisingly linear view of the past, symbolically captured in the modern relegation of time travel to science fiction, actually come into being. So this progressive future, one that is unidirectional and that does not allow access to the past, became further forged through other significant events in science and technology. For example, the law of thermodynamics specifically, developed most significantly during the 18th and 19th centuries, reinforced the linear notion of time speeding into the future toward a chaotic end, whereas Barbara Adam notes, energy was conserved, but could not be reversed. Doran van Rossum noted that only since the scientific revolution in the middle of the 17th century can one speak of experimentally qualifying scientific procedures and conceptions of time as a scaled continuum of discrete moments. Kevin Berth points out that time as a cultural construction has been largely shaped by the pursuit of scientific knowledge, with the key components of that construction being embedded in material objects such as clocks and calendars. Other significant temporal historical events, such as the building of the first long-distance railroads, the invention of the telegram, allowed the future to be conquered through a compression of space-time and allowed for people to conceive of the future in terms of conquest. In Time and Theory, Barbara Adam notes that how there was a shift in focus in the late 18th and 19th centuries from quantity and timeless laws to change, growth, evolution, which occurred almost simultaneously in physics, biology, astronomy, philosophy, and the arts. Many of these milestones intersect with or are simultaneous to significant events forming the beginning of and a proliferation of African enslavement. One could sketch out a timeline of significant events in Black American history, such as the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, or the last voyage of the transatlantic slave trade in 1887, for example, and find them in close succession to or overlapping socio-historical and temporal historical events, such as the first long-distance railroads, the law of thermodynamics, and the establishment of the standard time zones. Considering the relationship between the future and imperialism and colonialism, Stephen Kern notes how the annexation of the space of others and the outward movement of people and goods are examples of spatial expressions of the active appropriation of the future. British Foreign Minister Lord Rosebery, for example, noted in 1839 that the motivations for colonizing Africa is not about the present, not about what we want now, but what we shall want in the future. Rosebery considered the future as something to be mined, acknowledging the metaphor by stating that they were engaged in a business of pegging out claims for the future, considering he and his fellow imperialists trustees to the future of the race. In thinking about how enslaved Africans had to be transported, or even how they were found in the first place, one must consider time, as an accurate measurement of time became crucial to maritime navigation. Although you can measure latitude, north-south, by reading the sun, ship navigators had to guess in order to measure longitude, which often led to grave inaccuracies on long voyages. A clock or timekeeping device was necessary to accurately measure longitude, east-west. Wikipedia notes, since the Earth rotates at a steady rate of 360 degrees per day or 15 degrees per hour, there is a direct relationship between time and longitude. If the navigator knew the time at a fixed reference point when some event occurred at the ship's location, the difference between the reference time and the apparent local time would give the ship's position relative to the fixed location. Finding apparent local time is relatively easy. The problem, ultimately, was how to determine the time at a distance reference point while on a ship. In my opinion, this makes enslavement, the outward movement of people as goods, chattel slavery, the most potent example of the appropriation of the mode of time known as the future. The events that took place there comprised the first great indigenous African space-time splintering, a long-wave form of trauma that continues to spread, touching upon the present day. This splitting bears a close temporal relationship to what Kojo Ishun describes in further considerations on Afrofuturism as the founding moment of modernity. The inscription of linear space-time came to be discerned in later boundaries on slave ownership. 36 degrees and 30 inches north is the parallel of latitude that divides where slavery was allowed and prohibited in America under the Missouri Compromise, the line that separated the United States from the Confederate States. In the book Mastered by the Clock, Time, Slavery, and Freedom in the American South, Mark Smith describes the process by which white Southern slave owners adapted a mechanical clock time and corresponding linear construct as the dominant temporal consciousness over that of nature-based timekeeping methods. He notes in detail how this transition impacted the social order and reinforced values of discipline, economic gain, efficiency, and modernity. In general, an indigenous African space-time cultural tradition of time consciousness has been described as having a backwards linearity, in that when events occur, they immediately move backwards towards what scholar John Mbiti described as Zamani, or macro time. In many indigenous African cultures and spiritual traditions, time can be created, is independent of events, is not real until experienced, and is often intimately connected to genealogy, astrology, and ecological cycles. In his article, Time and Culture Among the Bamana, Mandinka, and Dogon of Mali, Kassim Kone provides examples of the ways in which the historical past and genealogies are conceptualized within context of space, place, totemic affiliation, and family names, for example, as opposed to exact chronology, recorded history, dominant figures, royal succession, centralized states, and international relations like in the West. From this time perspective, time is composed of events, days, while months and years are just a graphic or numerical representation of those events. The indigenous heritage of time often made no sharp distinction between the past, present, and future, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and generally uninterested in the minutiae of time, according to Omari H. Kakoli. In his worksheet, A Comparison of the Western and African Concepts of Time, Bert Haminga notes, we have to compare the Western linear dead physical timeline with past, future, and irregularly moving now, with the African living time. Kone points out that from a Western point of view, African time can be said to be one that is socialized, in contrast to a Western regimentation of time which favors the alienation of other people's space, place, and time by private individuals. Events are situated in time as well as in context. Indigenous African notions of time in many traditions were generally connected to natural events such as rainfall, the rising and setting of the sun, or saw time as a natural rhythm or pacing, such as the time it takes you to walk from one place to another. Kone points to the example of the Como farming ritual of the Bamana people, which makes offering sacrifices to religious deities through various farming activities, with its primary significance lying in its role in a social construction of time rather than as a ritual that sets in motion the farming season as seen by the West. Such an experience of time has such features as concern for the details of the event, regardless of the time required, exhaustive consideration of a problem until resolved, an emphasis on present experience rather than the past or the future. Future events in these traditions are situated in a potential time until experienced or actualized. Those events do not depend on some specific clock time or calendar date for its manifestation. Instead, time depends on the quality of the event and the person experiencing it. Once the future event is experienced, it instantaneously moves backward into the present and past dimensions. Those two dimensions bear the most ontological significance, where a person experiences time partly in his own individual life and partly through the society which goes back many generations before his own birth, according to Dr. Mbiti. A strong example of this, I think, is the word lobi, which in Lingala culture stands for both yesterday and tomorrow. You can only know which one is meant by looking at the context. Another potent example of the retention of the indigenous African spatial temporal orientation during slavery is the use of the North Star to point north on the Underground Railroad. Other examples include naming children after their day of birth or after ancestors. However, if but for survival purposes alone, enslaved Africans came to internalize some form of a linear time construct. Modern-day mechanical clock time and its ancillary linear temporal rhythms were encoded into the enslaved Black African by means of the whip and other forms of torture and physical violence, and enslaved Africans through this violent, brutal force and torture came to internalize some form of a linear time construct. Similarly, they were forbidden any access to the future, in much the same way they were denied access to full humanity, both in vision and in practice. In his essay, Time and Revolution in African America, Walter Johnson notes that one of the many things slaveholders thought they owned was their slaves' time. Indeed, to outline the temporal claims that slaveholders made upon their slaves is to draw a multidimensional portrait of slavery itself. Slaveholders defined the shape of the day, end quote. He goes on to note how slave masters controlled enslaved Africans' biographical time, where they recorded their slaves' birthdays in accounts books that only they could see. They determined at what age their slaves would be started into the fields or set to a trade, when their slaves would be cajoled into reproduction, and otherwise infuse their slaves' lives with their own time through the daily process of slave discipline. Masters further encoded a temporal order by use of sound. Bells, horns, public clocks, chants, songs, speech patterns, and the like were used to regulate slave labor on the plantation. Temporal literacy and ownership of timepieces was also for the most part forbidden for enslaved Africans, lest it be used as a tool by which they would gain their freedom. Timepieces came to be seen as a symbol of status and progress, as well as symbolic of the conquering of time and space, much like the train and the telegram. Enslaved peoples both obeyed and resisted clock time as if it were an extension of the slave master himself. Both Smith and Johnson detail ways in which time could be turned back upon its master by utilizing such passive strategies as working slowly, delaying conception, shamming sickness or slipping off, and more explicit acts such as mutinies, revolts, escapes, poisoning, magic practice, and other spiritual and religious practices. However, The so-called emancipation of enslaved Africans from bondage did not automatically free them of the master's clock. At the point of emancipation, the Western linear construct of space and time was already encoded into every aspect of the American way of life, and the Western way of life, social order, economy, transportation, and communication. Time continued to be used as another form of social control against oppressed communities. There was no practical way to totally eschew linear temporal consciousness while remaining in an American society. If seeking to integrate or at least peacefully coexist, compromises had to be made. A split spatial-temporal consciousness, one that I believe is parallel to that of the Boseian double consciousness, was thereby gradually developed in the emancipated African, what some have called colored peoples or CP time. There is no past, or rather, where does the line between the past and the present draw? Was slavery simply over once declared? At what time did we become free? If time orders our actions, when and where was the act of liberation, and when did subjugation end? What time was it in the land my people were stolen from? How far away from slavery are we when slavery as an institution was encoded into the dominant temporal order? In temporalities of pre-slavery, pre- and post-freedom superimposed and then collapsed into one or the other. At the turn of the century, an avant-garde Italian social movement known as Futurism attempted to revolutionize and reappropriate notions of the future in art, architecture, literature, and culture. Believing that the cult of reverence to the past and to tradition should die, they created manifestos, artwork, music, and critical theory around a future rapidly speeding toward them. Much like Einstein's relativistic future, the future had run into now, or as Filippo Marinetti wrote in Manifesto of Futurism in 1909, time and space died yesterday. In a manifesto of the futurist painters written circa 1910, the futurists declared that the triumphant progress of science makes profound changes in humanity inevitable. In their view, such changes were hacking an abyss between those docile slaves of past tradition and us free moderns who are confident in the radiant splendor of our future. They embraced a violent, clashing, chaotic technological future, one that was constantly changing and perpetually at war with its own ideas. The future was not set, and because it was so transient, there could be no permanent buildings, monuments, or empires. Envisioning themselves as a catalyst for Italy's rebirth, politics and culture were intermeshed for the Italian futurists, with the Futurism movement containing some elements of anarchism and fascism. The inevitable consequence of this rapidly changing future envisioned by the Italian futurists, and the ones illustrated by science fiction, is what Alvin Toffler called future shock, to describe the shattering stress and disorientation that we induce in individuals by subjecting them to too much change in too short a time. He believed that the greatly accelerated rate of social and technological change in our society produced mostly negative personal and psychological consequences, arising from the superimposition of a new culture on an old one, and producing a form of culture shock that the victim cannot recover from. This was what Marinetti and the Italian futurists wished for, a future now, one that permanently split from the past, brought about by a violent expansion of the scope of change. For Toffler, we were racing too far into the future and too quickly. The term future shock itself spread through popular culture, theory, and media after the release of Toffler's book. Curtis Mayfield had a song called Future Shock on his album, which was then covered by Herbie Hancock as the title track for his 1983 recording, a jazz-funk electronic fusion that was considered futuristic for its own time. Future shock, as described by Mayfield, is a world of poverty, drug addiction, hunger, and desperation. He says in the song, "When won't we understand this is our last and only chance? Everybody, it's a future shock." His words evoke a presentism time orientation, the darker side of the future is now mantra. This represents how oppressed people today, particularly the descendants of enslaved Africans, embody temporal tensions, a disunity between our cultural notions of time. And little analyzed are the ways in which contemporarily this temporal orientation of presentism is connected to class, poverty, oppression, racism, and the legacy of slavery. Use of the presentism time orientation is class and by extension race-based. It has been recently reappropriated by New Age philosophy, yoga, and meditation. However, when a presentism time orientation is applied to Black people, it is often cited negatively, considered as lacking a sense of future and only concerned with pleasant pleasures and immediate concerns. It has been associated with laziness, indolence, and lateness. Those traits are in turn used to justify the Black community's disproportionate rates of poverty, joblessness, homelessness, disease, and the like. In studies on increased presence of heart disease in African Americans, for example, a presentism time orientation is often cited as one of the causal factors. African Americans with a present time orientation, in quotes, may not see the need to take preventative medication or to finish antibiotics when symptoms disappear, or, in quotes, may delay seeking a physician until symptoms are severe and begin interfering with their work or life. Those quotes came from a cultural diversity training. Often, culture-based fears of the hospitals and medical institutions are due to decades of illegal medical experimentation on Blacks or the inability to afford sustained medical treatment. But again, this presentism orientation, usually referred to as CP time when applied to Black people, is underanalyzed in its connection to slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. Slavery was where time was inculcated into our very skin, where the ring of the bell or the tick of the clock regulated our fate, our labor, our birth, and our death, taking over the natural rhythms and spirits and spatial temporal orientation and consciousness of our indigenous lands. And I only speak here of temporal disorientation, but a spatial disorientation should also be implied, to the extent that the fabric of the two are co-associated in an Einsteinian universe. CP time, or colored people's time, has been both a defense mechanism against Black communal trauma and post-trauma under the conditions of class warfare and racial oppression, and a hearkening back to a more natural, ancestral, temporal, spatial consciousness and presentism. Jeremy Rifkin explains that the consequences of the linear progress narrative being applied to an oppressed people keeps them confined in a narrow temporal band, unable to anticipate and plan for their own future, powerless to affect their political fate, end quote. For those deprived of access to the future becomes untrustworthy and unpredictable. They become stuck only being able to plan for the present and limited time in the future as the society around them speeds forward in illusory linear progress. This narrow temporal band is used to penalize people on a daily basis. And in the present day, we continue to be punished for not being on time. For being 10 minutes late to an appointment, for example, you could lose your job, your children, your home, your freedom. Hierarchies of time and lack of access to the future informs intergenerational poverty in the same way that wealth passes down between generations in traditionally privileged families. Such a narrow temporal band is clearly distinguishable from the sense of presentism or living in a moment that is offered as an option for those tapping into or capitalizing off of so-called New Age techniques appropriated from ancient spiritual practices and spatial temporal orientations. So how do we negotiate time and space in relation to the events that forced us upon these shores, the transatlantic slave trade? And I think that provides context for the struggles that we continue to endure in the present. As Ishun notes, it is never a matter of forgetting what it took so long to remember. Rather, the vigilance that is necessary to indict imperial modernity must be extended into the field of the future, end quote. We were told that slavery ended, but if so, when remains the crucial question, particularly with the linear temporal spatial history of the world fully intact. That a community bound by particular events in space-time, such as enslavement, would experience overlapping and conflicting temporalities should be of no surprise. Zerubbabel rightly points out that being social presupposes the ability to experience things that happen to the groups which we belong long before we even join them, as if they were part of our personal past, and that such a remarkable existential fusion of one's personal history with that of the communities to which one belongs also helps explain the tradition of pain and suffering carried by American descendants of African slaves, as well as the personal sense of shame felt by many young Germans about the atrocities of a regime that ended long before they were born. Theoretical physicist Alberto Hernando de Castro uses the laws of physics to study the ways in which communities retain social memories, finding a time-based underlying logic in how communities develop and interact. A community's growth is largely dependent on factors in that community's past. This research is used in understanding how traumatic and post-traumatic events can connect or disconnect us from our past, and the ways in which human behavior in an aggregate can influence an entire community or city. It helps us to understand how historical events, such as slavery or war, transforms our communities in such a way that it displaces us completely from those events and those sources. The past is still with us, in contact with the present, not cut off along a temporal axis, like in the block universe or the master's clockwork universe. So how can we control our own time and create new cultural, healthier time orientations? How can we encode new temporal algorithms? What does it mean to dismantle the master's clock physically, spiritually, psychologically, cognitively? How do we access and take back control of communal memory? How do we begin to map our return to our own futures? There is a necessity to dismantle the master's clock and to reinscribe a colored people's time, or perhaps more affirmatively, to construct a new diasporic African spatial temporal consciousness. There is a necessity to dissolve or dismantle the thermodynamic arrow of time and the arrow of progress. Mechanical time is not absolute time. The present moment is in the ether and the absolute frame of reference. It is unrealistic to expect that we can ever return to the time consciousness of our more distant ancestors, enacting a complete reversal to a pre-transatlantic slave trade spatial temporal construct. In recognizing that it is not realistic to enact a complete reversal, we can instead incorporate particular aspects of these time constructs as they parallel or overlap natural tendencies already encoded into the descendants of formerly enslaved Africans. We seek to reconcile our bifurcated time consciousness by creating or adapting a time consciousness consistent with our experiences as diasporic displaced Africans, living in communities that have by and large adopted a linear time construct. Womanist and feminist movements have also articulated alternative modes of temporality, ones that reveal to us time's multifaceted and multiform nature, but from the perspective and experiences of women. Womanist and feminist movements have studied temporal issues and tools to theorize on such issues as time, age, change, choice, self-image, and the related implications of women's changing roles. In the essay Familiar Explorations, Temporality in Women's Writing, Irma Garcia notes that women's time is purely affective time, disrupting pre-established schemas and structures, and how in feminine time in general, notions of the past, present, and future are interdependent and blend into each other. The time-traveling Black woman protagonist Dana in Octavia Butler's speculative novel Kindred demonstrates this blended affective temporality well. She had to ensure the continuation of her family's timeline in the antebellum South, and by extension her own birth, several hundred years into the future. Scholar Michelle M. Wright highlights how Butler and other Black womanist writers such as Alice Walker create bold new models for self-defined or internally defined notions of tradition, one Black and female. Tradition, as understood here, emphasizes an overlapping past and present temporal dimension, and a relationship of those two dimensions to each other involves a future trajectory, if considered within a traditional linear temporal construct of forward progressive movement. I would argue in support of an articulated theory of Black womanist temporalities, given our unique intersectional temporal experiences as Black and woman. On the November 2015 cover of Wired magazine, the words, "Let's change the future," are written in bold pink neon, previewing an issue dedicated to race, gender, and equality in a digital age, and guest edited by tennis star Serena Williams. The issue features articles on Black Lives Matter as the 21st century civil rights movement, the lack of diversity in the tech industry, and one on a perceived battle over diversity that recently erupted in science fiction culture. In the article War of the Worlds, Amy Wallace notes that sci-fi that accommodates one future and one kind of politics and one kind of person just isn't doing its job. Understanding the utility of science fiction to envision new futures and new worlds in concrete terms, particularly for societies marginalized, Wallace's words call to mind those of Octavia Butler, who in an essay called Positive Obsession mused, What good is science fiction's thinking about the present, the future, and the past? What good is its tendency to warn, to consider alternative ways of thinking and doing? What good is its examination of the possible effects of science and technology or social organization and political direction? At its best, science fiction stimulates imagination and creativity. And what good is all of this to Black people? End quote. Liberation movements like Afrofuturism and Black Quantum Futurism reappropriate notions of time and temporality itself, stealing back time to actively create a vision of the future for marginalized people who are typically denied access to creative control over the temporal mode of the future, and redefining that future's relationship to the past and the present. This may involve a reinvestigation and an uncovering of hidden histories, and a hacking into future histories where we have already been erased, ensuring our appearance, ensuring our continued existence, even when the active period has ended on a linear progressive timeline and receded into the so-called inaccessible past. In this spirit, the concept and community of Afrofuturism has emerged as a tool, medium, and lens with which marginalized Black communities across the diaspora might evaluate and shape our futures. According to Ingrid Lafleur, Afrofuturism is a way of imagining possible futures through a Black cultural lens. For D. Denenge Akpem, it is an exploration and methodology of liberation, simultaneously both a location and a journey. Along with Afrofuturism, a number of other alternative movements have emerged over the past few years: Chicano futurism, queer futurism, Crip futurity, to name a few, to appropriate or redefine notions of future while actively exploring what the future might look like for marginalized people. For its part, Afrofuturism lends itself well to exploring pathways to liberation, unearthing our true histories, mapping our futures, and understanding our present conditions in the flow of time. Because it provides a perpetual bridge between the past, the present, and the future, Afrofuturism and the Black speculative imagination can be used as liberation technologies to build future worlds. In 2011, I created the Afrofuturist Affair, a grassroots organization dedicated to celebrating and promoting Afrofuturistic culture and literature through creative events and creative writing. In 2012, I became a founding member of Metro Polarity, a queer speculative fiction collective, and co-created Black Quantum Futurism Collective with my partner, More Mother, in 2014. I created and helped create these spaces because I needed to be part of a community of creative people who are actively engaging what the future can look like for those who have been marginalized and oppressed, and not as a mere reinforcement or just an evolution of the same social structures we are presently oppressed by. From this standpoint, you can engage the speculative future from the imagination of Octavia Butler, envision the future formed by the liberation philosophies of Marcus Garvey, or even disrupt the structures of systemic racism, law, and social policy through the short science fiction stories of late civil rights attorney Derek Bell. The power of speculation, futurism, and envisioning something different and better for oneself should be accessible to anyone. The ability to create the future you want to live in, the ability to interact with your past and history to create better visions of the future for yourself and your community should belong to us all. The intersections of science fiction, Afrofuturism, and legal work played a prominent role in the formation of my project, Community Futures Lab. Community Futures Lab was a year-long oral history and what I called Oral Futures Recording Lab and pop-up community resource library workshop space and gallery located in a Philadelphia neighborhood known as Sharswood. The area is currently undergoing a multi-million-dollar redevelopment project, while longtime homeowners, businesses, and tenants were displaced and permanently relocated as the city demolished, blighted, and deteriorating high-rise and low-rise public housing and took 1,300 properties by eminent domain. Community Futurism is documenting the redevelopment of this neighborhood through the project, and we think about this project in the context of memory and time. Recorded social history undermines personal history, personal experience, and communal memory, particularly if you come from a poor or marginalized community. The digital divide further impacts upon the ability of impoverished and marginalized communities to share their own stories and art in a world where mainstream media regularly distorts and misrepresents them. The future has become more than inaccessible. It is a threat to families and individuals due to things like big data, surveillance, and further widening of the digital divide. This is particularly true in the city I come from, Philadelphia, which has ranked as the largest, poorest city in America for over 3 years now. And in some ways, the trickle-down effects of white flight and urban blight and their twin evil gentrification have caused time to stand still for Philadelphia. In certain areas of the city lie time vortices where the Philadelphia of Sunrod's day, when he lived there, is superimposed on top of the present. The racism, poverty, and inequality that incited profound emotion and inspired profound genius within Sun Ra remains entrenched in parts of our city. In Philadelphia, poverty continues to disproportionately impact people of color, single mothers, and children. Compared with a citywide poverty rate of 27%, 31% of African Americans, 41% of Hispanics, half of single mothers, and 1 in 3 children live in poverty. And none of that is by accident. In fact, when the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed by white slave-owning drafters right in Philadelphia, seeking to secure their future visions of the United States, Black people were not meant to be part of that vision except as mere commodity. Black bodies being denied full humanity under the color of the law and in the eyes of the country's forefathers had no stake in humanity's future and had no more agency in that future. Again, Octavia Butler's Kindred explores the implications of this. She explores the implications of the inaccessibility of the future to enslaved Africans and the utility and futility of fore and hindsight when traveling along a progressive world line. Butler's protagonist lands 200 years into her relative past, pulled back by a soon-to-become slave-owning, slave-raping ancestor, whom she must choose to continue to save in order to ensure her own timeline and bloodline. The date of Dana's last trip is the bicentennial of the 4th of July. Philadelphia, once the ultimate futurist city of the white male utopian vision, is a city built upon the graves, ghosts, hands, and backs of Blackness. A place where in present day, gentrification and racialized segregation have changed the landscape of Blackness and pushed its memory and resonance to the edges of the city, into temporal spatial ghettos and other vortices or prisons of temporal chaos. Community's Futures Lab sat in the midst of such a vortice. In the media, Sharswood has been portrayed as complicit in its own poverty, violence, and without a past, a meaningful history, a sense of community, or a future. Community Futures Lab worked with the residents of the neighborhood to dismantle that narrative and to allow the community to envision and create its own future and recover and archive its own history through oral history, mapping, and art making. Over the course of the year, we were located directly in that community on an avenue once known as a successful business district with a rich legacy of jazz and art. So some of the questions that project and that I continue to ask through my work is how can we control our own time and create new cultural, healthier time orientations? And how else can we position progress when we exist within our own spatial temporal environments? And how do we join allegiance with others in spite of that, settling on common visions of the future for our communities? I believe there's a meaningful way to embrace the paradox and allow 2 opposing temporal modes to coexist in the same way that light coexists both as wave and particle on a quantum level. It's done by crafting a unique time construct that takes into account a Western linear time mode and our own natural time tendencies as inscribed in our DNA through biology, ancestry, culture, spirit, and natural rhythms. Such a time construct inevitably requires a new language. It requires a way to speak of the past, present, and future without hierarchies. Ishun notes that by creating temporal complications and anachronistic episodes that disturb the linear time of progress, these futures adjust the temporal logics that condemn Black subjects to prehistory, end quote. How do oppressed people conceive of their own future in the face of hostile visions of the future? Black quantum futurism is exploring and developing modes and practices of spatial temporal consciousness that are more beneficial to marginalized people's survival in a high-tech world currently dominated by these oppressive linear time constructs. BQF calls for actively engaging temporalities and adopting alternative temporal orientations and frameworks, which in turn helps to shift the meaning or placement of the future and shifts the means of access to the future. To quote Jeremy Rifkin again, "The new time rebels advocate a radically different approach to temporality," end quote. Again, if one repositions their temporal lens, we can meaningfully disrupt linear notions of time. We can determine what meaning and what relationships the past and the future have to our present moment. Thank you.
So if you have any questions, you are free to ask.
Hi, I was thinking about the project that you did in Philadelphia. How did you gain access to those people? Were you invited in, or did you get a grant, or?
A couple of different ways. So I actually live in a neighborhood. So I knew what was happening already and was in touch with people who live there. I'm also an attorney by day, and I do housing work. I represent low-income people in Philadelphia who are facing loss of their housing. And so I was already representing some people in that neighborhood and was already kind of involved in what was happening with the redevelopment and doing policy work to make sure that people who wanted to come back to the neighborhood would be able to come back. And so it made a lot of sense to start this project from the perspective of myself as an artist and an activist and attorney. It was like a great intersection. So I conceived of the project, and then I applied for some funding for it, and I got funding through a project called A Blade of Grass, which funds what's called socially engaged art projects like that. So they gave funding for it, and I was able to open a storefront with the funding, and had the storefront for about a year. And we held events and workshops and did oral histories, interviews with people, and also provided housing resources. And the project was very, very intentional about not imposing ourselves on people or making it something that people felt they had to engage with. It was a very much come as you wish, come when you please sort of thing. We had a lot of interns working there during the day so that it was open at regular times so that people could just come in if they just needed some support or had questions about what was happening in the community. So there was no pressure. And then we also crafted our workshops we really took into account this thing about people's time and how people spend their time and people's subjective temporalities. So we structured all of our workshops, we have maybe 3 or 4 a month, as walk-in workshops, and made it so that anybody could walk in at any point in the workshop and become engaged, and they could leave at any point, and it wouldn't hurt the rest of the workshop. So that was kind of how we got into it. And I'm still, even though the storefront is closed, I'm still working very closely with the community and doing things to sort of try to preserve affordable housing in that area. So.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I found it really interesting. So I was a bit hesitant to ask this question because I'm aware it's a bit maybe abstract and theoretical, and you said you're very tired, so feel free to shelve it for like later in the weekend. Basically, just going back a little bit to like Frantz Fanon, for example, where in the 70s you have this idea of displacement and, a double consciousness coming through in terms of racial critical theory as pathologized as a problem, psychologically speaking, in terms of the Black subject. Do you feel that Afrofuturism tends to take that and puts maybe a more positive spin on it? Like ideas like alienation, displacement, etc. They all become more positive attributes somehow.
Yeah, I think it does have that power. I think it has the power to complicate it, if nothing else. I think what's positive and negative is sometimes subjective, but I do think that Afrofuturism is a technology to go back and be able to re-explore those things with a different lens and a more empowering, if you will, I don't really like that word, but just a more empowering lens to be able to really unpack some of these things like how schizophrenia was used against Black communities and particularly activist communities, and that's actually something that's time memorial. That's going back to slavery when they invented diseases and psychological diseases, for us if we were running away as slaves and things like that. I think Afrofuturism gives us a language to go back and interrogate that and to understand what it means and to complicate those narratives and those things, and it's really powerful in that respect, at least in my opinion. If that answers your question, I think.
What first drew you to exploring the question of time and Blackness through the lens of Afrofuturism?
Octavia Butler. Kindred. I've been, it was a very long journey. I think this is a story that a lot of Black people experience just as in terms of their journey of coming to these things and coming to people like Mama Butler. For me, I have always loved time travel. I've always loved sci-fi since I was a young kid. I watched the movies. I've been a sci-fi writer since I was a little kid. But it wasn't until, and then I grew up and I went to college, and then I started to understand myself as a Black woman, and started to reflect that the things that I was enjoying and ingesting didn't reflect me. And so I actually didn't mess with science fiction for a long time. And then several years later, after college, a friend gave me a copy of Kindred. And for some reason, I had heard of Octavia Butler. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what her deal was. But that was it. It just opened my brain. Octavia Butler. And then from her, I went on to other things and came upon the community of Afrofuturism, mostly online, through the internet. Black Science Fiction Society is a website that's like the Facebook of Black science fiction. Going on there and being a part of that community is kind of what brought me to Afrofuturism. But for me, I found it to be immediately a very academic sort of place and something that was very much on the internet and accessible to people who had access to things like that. And so for me, in starting my organization, the Afrofuturist Affair, and just continuing to do the work that I do, has been of utmost importance that Afrofuturism be made accessible to communities, marginalized communities, poor Black folk, people who don't have access to the internet or have access immediately to these sort of cultural networks and things that other people have. So that was a process of recognizing my own privileges also, in terms of I have a college education, I have a full-time job, I can do, I can access these things and trying to understand how we can open that up to people, because if we're talking about the future, we have to include marginalized people in that conversation. Sure. All right, I think that was it.